Welcome to the Creative Industry Insight podcast, a podcast that looks at various roles in the creative world. I'm your host, Bobby. Today's guest, sound designer Randy Torres, joins us to talk about their work on Oppenheimer. Please be warned there are heavy spoilers in this episode, so sit back and relax as we jump into the conversation with Randy. Hi, Randy. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is one I say every episode that I'm excited to jump in, but I am generally excited for every episode, but I'm also extra excited because we get to talk about Oppenheimer today. One of the most anticipated films of the year. Saw it in 70mm print, looks gorgeous, had the Dolby Atmos, pretty certain in certain parts with the sound. It gave me like a back massage because it was so like vibrating in the seat. So, thank you for that.
Good.
And just after, we're recording this the weekend, it's just come out. And how have you found the reaction to all? Because it's come against Barbie. There's a lot of sort of memes that have come out regarding both Barbie and Oppenheimer and endless memes popping up.
Yeah, it just kind of took it just turned into its own thing. It's exciting because it's making people excited about going to the cinema. So it's just, you couldn't have any more opposite films against each other, but it just seemed to work out. So, and they're two really great films. And I think when you're working on something, at least for sound, we focus on little parts of the film for so long. Sometimes we don't always see it from front to back. And I knew it was good. We knew it was good, but you never really know if an audience is going to react to it. So it's just great. It's great to see that people are liking it. And it's a really intriguing, interesting story. So I'm just happy that people like it.
I guess if you're working on something like, I guess sometimes you don't know how good something can be until people have seen it. And when you're working with certain talent as well, you could be like, oh, wow, this is going to be really cool. But then I guess if you have like average Joe on the street being like, oh my gosh, this is like the best thing I've seen in
Right.
years, then you're like, oh crap, I
Well,
actually worked on something really good.
right. Yeah. You just never really know when people are going to be into something. And there are just definitely films that I've worked on where I thought it was going to be amazing and people were going to be into it and people were not into it. And it's just a weird thing. But luckily for this one, it seems like people love it. So,
Yeah, and like I enjoyed it. If I have the opportunity, then maybe try go again, see it, or maybe take my dad as an excuse because then I can push that past significant others by using the family card to take them.
right.
But just to jump back from the start, how did the project come about? Because during my research, I've noticed that you've worked with Christopher Nolan and the team on a number of projects. So on Tenet, Dunkirk, and I think you did some work on Interstellar as well.
Yeah. So Richard King, who is Christopher's collaborator since I think The Prestige is when Richard started working for Chris. And so Richard's the supervising sound editor and he's just kind of our boss. So he kind of heads the crew of me, another sound effects editor, dialogue editors, Foley editors. So when a job comes from Chris, it goes to Richard, and then Richard has his crew, and I'm part of Richard's crew. So anytime any job goes to Richard, it's us that that benefit from whatever job it is, if that makes sense.
It sounds like a soprano sort of setup. You've got the
He's
head
the
of the
boss.
family who's like, okay, I'll take this. Who wants this? Who
Right.
who's going to do this? But I still think once you have that core team, right, and you've worked for a number of years, and
Yeah.
even looking at Richard's CV, where he's done even like going back to stuff like Twister and
Yeah. Yeah.
Waterworld and seeing stuff like that, it's like a bit of OG, shall we say, in
Yeah.
the as a kids would say. So I guess once you're in that sort of world where you're with people who you could trust and you constantly rely on, then you can kind of sort of hand work down to
Right.
people.
Yeah, Chris usually for the most part he uses the same crew for almost all of his films. And he knows these people and he knows that they all work well together, so he just uses the same people. And it's kind of the same thing with Richard. It's like I've been working for Richard for I think the better part of 7 years. So yeah, you just try to keep it within a team, and you know the people that you work with, and we work well together. So
Yeah, and that's the best way to sort of go about it, especially on films where so many people work together. It's like such a massive collaborative project.
right,
It's like one person gets a lot of the plaudits as a director, but there's like a whole army behind them to make sure that they look good and that the film looks good as well,
right,
or
right,
sounds good in this case,
and
right?
sound good, yeah, right.
But when it comes to a project like this, where do you begin in designing sound? Because as well, like even though this film takes place, it starts off in the 20s and it goes through a number of time periods. Like, what are the sort of challenges that present themselves when you're creating the sound design?
So period pieces, something like this, it's obviously really important with mostly the backgrounds to make sure the backgrounds are relevant to the time period. And we would just go through and see each scene. Everything is broken up into reels. So whichever reels which were in wherever time period, we would try to stick to the cars that were into the time period. We would try to do the right phones, the right rings, just things that you don't notice, you shouldn't notice when you're watching the film. I think if you do notice it, then we did something wrong, but it's just the overall ambience of each scene. We just try to keep it relevant to the time period. So yeah, using certain cars that were built within, a 5 to 6 era of time for background. Like it's just, you just have to be careful that there's no cell phones in something, or if there's a jet passing over a background, like we obviously can't use that, just stuff like that.
It's so simple when you think about it that, oh, how would you use, start off with something like cars and phones of that time era? Because as you said, you go over a certain amount of times. You can use those cars or phone
Right.
sounds over a certain period. But then again, it's just so simple that, like, as an
Yeah.
audience member, like I think we are so accustomed to, obviously we are looking at the screen, but also the sound bringing you in, that sort of the sounds of a car or phone and that everyday life is so
Right.
like ingrained in us that when
Yeah.
you hear that certain sound, I wouldn't actually think, oh yeah, that could be a phone sound from
Right.
1940s, or the car sound of like how the muffler might sound, which again is like, again, it's so simple, but then such a great way to then build around it to then
Right.
build the sound into the scenes.
Right. Yeah, and it's funny, like most other films that I've worked on, some of them are in modern times, and when you're creating a soundscape of, let's say, an office, you're using laptop keyboards, you're using computer keyboards. So for this, obviously computers didn't exist, so we would need to it would have to be a typewriter or, rotary phones, just the things that obviously existed back then. And it's like I was saying, if you notice these things, then we did it wrong. Like it should just bring you into a scene, and you should just assume that it's correct for the time period. So
Yeah, exactly. And even starting to build up from there in terms of like the typewriter and then or the sound of the certain pen that might be used during that era,
oh,
which probably makes it quite difficult as well because of the scratching of the paper. The paper might be different because the paper is going to be slightly thicker than paper used today, or you don't have that. The weight of the paper will be different if it falls down.
right.
It's like all those little things that like sometimes people may not actually consider in their mind. But then on top of that, if you're working in certain periods, are there sort of sounds that you might not be able to find, or do you have to trawl through old footage grabbing sounds from those clips? So I guess like something that comes to mind is the bulb on the old cameras
Mhm.
going off. I know old cameras have come back in fashion now, and people are using them different film cameras, but I don't think I've ever seen one of those bulb cameras around. So
Right.
when it comes to building something like that, do you have to sort of build that sort of sound from scratch, or is that something that you have to sort of just find through YouTube or old sound clips that somebody might have stored?
Yeah, usually something like that, because it's so specific. Luckily, it does exist in some sound library somewhere. And those flashbulbs in particular that you're referencing to, pretty sure, I think we have a pretty big library over at work, and I can just search for camera, flash bulb, flash something, and you'll get hundreds of different flash bulbs. And you just got to go through and it's like, does that one seem like that's correct? Does that one seem like it's correct? And usually we sweeten it with other things like the shutter and a click just to make it seem like it's real. It's like we always ask ourselves when we do something like that, it's like, do you believe it? I believe it. Do you believe it? Like if it's a believable, if you think, oh, that's how that camera sounds, then we've done it.
Do you ever sort of close your eyes in that moment, or when you're building in it and you have somebody like Richard come in, do you get them to close their eyes and then let them play the sound out to say, do you believe that that
Yeah,
is
totally.
that? Yeah.
When I
Okay.
say that all the time to him, like I'll ask him, like, do you believe that? Like we really do say that. But yeah, totally. You'll close your eyes and just kind of put yourself into the scene and just see if it works. And you could spend months on a scene, like a couple of those scenes where you see the flash bulbs going off, and then there will be music on top of it, and you go, oh wait, that doesn't work. So I need to use a different flash bulb, or I need to, move it this way or move it that way. So it's something that it's like a constant, we're always reevaluating things to see if it plays against the music okay, see if it plays against the dialogue okay, see if it fits for the scene.
When you said about moving the sound, is that a case of just having it in sync with the footage on screen, or is it a case of just sort of moving it so that it doesn't, you mean moving it, maybe just lowering the volume so it doesn't overtake the scene?
Yeah, a bit of both. It needs, if you see a flashbulb on screen, you have to sync to it, or else it would be weird for a flashbulb going off seeing one. But it just depends on the scene, and sometimes we have to move if there's one that's not in sync and it's like kind of in the background. We'll have to move it in such a way that if it was like up against a dialogue line, like something really important, if somebody's saying something, sometimes we'll move things so you can hear a line more clearly.
Yeah, I think as well with Christopher Nolan films that the sound does play a big part in your experience, and that also comes with the soundtrack as well and dialogue. There is I know sometimes people have said that there's certain instances where they can't hear what's being said, but I think that's maybe an reference for the director and you guys as like a way of like, maybe as audience members, it's like that's deliberate because we're being told what we want to hear rather
Yeah,
than
yeah.
somebody not doing the mix correctly, which is like, come on, like you know it's not like it's not gonna happen. But when
That's
it
100% true, by the way.
what that somebody's messed up the mix, or or
Yeah,
somebody's always like deliberate that you need to hear what you, as an audience member, you need to hear.
yeah. Like during the mix, everything's painstakingly gone through a million times. It's not like we're willy-nilly just turning things up and down, having a good time. Like everything is very deliberate. So if there is dialogue that you can't hear, I think just people automatically is like, wait a minute, like what did they say? But if you didn't hear it, it could be deliberate. Maybe it isn't. Sometimes, most of the times, it is though.
Yeah, and I think if you miss what's being said, as it is deliberate, but that's also adding confusion. You're like being put into the feet of the character, because
Right.
if you're not hearing it, then they're not hearing it, and then you're like, well, who's missed what, for example?
Right.
But even talking about the sort of the soundtrack and the dialogue, how do you make sure like your sound design doesn't overpower the dialogue and soundtrack in the film?
Yeah,
Because
that's just usually during the mix, and it depends on what Chris wants. Because if it's a scene where he wants the sound effects to overpower the music or the sound effects to overpower the dialogue, like it's just part of whatever feeling that they're trying to get out of that certain scene.
okay, because with a film like Oppenheimer, it's I was quite surprised how much of a score there was being played in the film. It feels like I wouldn't say 100%, but about 90% or about 85% of the film has score, which has a mixture of certain sounds. But once you're there, it all sort of blends in really nicely in terms of you as an audience member kind of feeling the scene, hearing what people are saying, and also hearing the score to help you have that emotional impact added to it. Going back to like the sound design in itself, this is something that sort of popped up in my mind when I was watching it, and it's like maybe this is just maybe a silly thought by me, just because I knew that I was going to sit down and talk to you about this. But I'm curious about the sound that is made from things like shoes. So when you're at the Alamo camp, a lot of it is made out of wood. So there's always going to be a distinct sound that is created with shoes or how people walk. How do you go about creating the sound for each character? Like, do you know what sort of type of shoe that the character wearing, or is it just something that you create a sort of blanket sound and then make it louder dependent on how they are moving in the scene?
So something like that, we had our Foley artist Dan O'Connell and then our Foley supervisor Chris Flick kind of take that on, and essentially they just look at the scene, they look at the shoes that he's wearing, and they replicate it. On the stage where Dan O'Connell does his thing. There he has different surfaces, different concrete, different wood. Some of it's hollow, some of it's raised. So they'll just look at the scene, let's just for an example, Oppie's shoes. And I think most of the film he's wearing, I think just loafers, if I remember correctly, with a rubber sole. So they'll go out, and if they don't have something, they'll go buy like the same similar types of shoes, and they'll do it on a wood surface or on something that's wood that has maybe a hollow section of it. Like they'll get as detailed as they can to just make it, it's like I was saying before, make you believe that that's a shoe on that surface.
Okay, so there's a lot of sort of research and development in terms of what's going to sound right and what the character's going to be wearing. Just because I was thinking about it as well with Matt Damon's character, because he's the general, he's going to have a sort of heavy shoe
Right.
or heavy boot, but then also he always walks with a lot of purpose, quite important as well. So I can imagine that it's like a lot of heavy thumping, and then the scientists with their shoes being maybe having some sort of heel, so you could hear the click clacking when they're on wood, or even in the mud, the little like squelching of it all.
Yeah. Yeah, if it's a scene with mud, they'll make mud on the Foley stage. If there's like most of the Los Alamos stuff, it's all pretty hard packed dirt. So they'll go in and specifically use like hard packed dirt, like the right kind of dirt. And Foley is crazy. It's definitely the most specific part of the process. And they'll go in and just painstakingly look at every frame and, look at what they're like. Some scenes, a character will walk, let's say, in between some wood stairs into some dirt, onto some concrete, like onto a carpet. And so the Foley artist will do that, and they'll edit it together in such a way that that's what it is, like a footstep going from wood stairs into dirt and onto a carpet, onto concrete. And it's stuff like that. It's like I was saying before, you should notice it. You should just believe what's happening on screen. Like if you notice, like, wait a minute, there's a footstep there, then I think we did it wrong. We didn't do it correctly. Like it should just put you into the scene, and you should just believe what's going on.
Yeah, 100%. And I think I had somebody at university tell me this, that like an audience member will forgive a picture on the screen because if something flickers, you might think, oh, something's changed or it's deliberate by the DOP. But if the sound is off, then that's it. You're like
Right.
completely taken out of the film.
Yeah, it should distract you from being in the film. Exactly.
Yeah, and then I think if that overshadows it, then sometimes it's like, was
Right.
that correct? And then you kind of look at each other in the audience and be like, did I
Yeah,
hear that
what?
correctly? Is that
What was
correctly?
that? Yeah, totally.
Exactly. There's also, how could we not mention Big Bomb Test in the film, where there's a lot of tension going on, and even in like what's being shown, what you can hear, the build up to it, is it going to work? People making bets on like, are they going to destroy the planet? Is it not even going to detonate? Which is a bit like, in a weird way, a morbid way of thinking of making bets, right? But I guess if you bet big and saying the planet will be destroyed, and it does, then you're not gonna get the fruits of your labor, I guess, in that sort of way. But
Right.
what was quite noticeable in the scene is like once the explosion happens, there's a time delay with the sound of the explosion, and like of course like the science behind it is due to light traveling faster than sound, which is fine, which is like makes it even more accurate. But as an audience member, like we are kind of left in silence with just heavy breathing, and then the pure force of the bomb hits you. So the person next to me jumped because they were scared by that sound, because it went from that sort of silence of heavy breathing and explosion. So, hats off to you. Was this something that was always a creative decision when it came about it?
Yep.
And like, what was the desired impact when you were creating the sound design for the scene?
Yeah, I think the first thing is just just accuracy of if you were there. And we actually had a map of the Los Alamos bomb site in our rooms, and you could see like where the detonation went off, where Oppie and his brother were. Like there was three separate distances between where the bomb was, and so there was definitely a lot of thought into like, you know, when the blast sound would come through each of those three different, I'll just say, silos of where people were. And it was always something that was, you know, Chris's idea, and that's just what he wanted. And I think it's a lot more powerful because you see, instead of a big, huge, ginormous explosion, and you don't hear people's like reactions to it. Like you want to see those people's reactions because it's the first time anything like that has ever happened in the history of the world. And it's just, and it catches you off guard when all of a sudden you hear the blast. It's like you were saying, your friend jumped. Like then it was done correctly, because it should be, it should blow you off your seat. It should scare you because it is scary. So, but yeah, that was definitely all very much creatively planned out like that.
Even watching that scene back, if when watching it back, if I get another chance to see it in the cinema or get it on Blu-ray, it's just that the whole idea of like the building of the breath, and just sort of, I guess, in a way, I guess it's like a bit of relief and exhilaration
Right.
in like what's happened, because as you said, like this is the first time anyone's ever done something like this, and then the wild celebrations that follow, because it's like, wow, like we've accomplished what we were set out to do. But I don't think anyone actually realized the sort of atrocities that it would
Right.
like
Right.
follow in terms of once the bombs were dropped. But that's for another day. But with the just like the I guess it becomes like slightly unbearable for Oppenheimer, because he like maybe it's something
You
that you
just
just
realize what is going to happen, what just happened. It's just,
yeah.
you can see it like in his facial reactions. He doesn't even need to say something. You just look at his face and you know that he's processing what, you know, they just did and it's what's coming. And you can tell like that's the beginning of him. It starts weighing on him a lot of the gravity of what they just created.
They're kind of like strips back in that scene. And I think that sort of point segues to sort of my next question as well, because in some scenes, there's a stomping sound that we can hear building up in the background. And I always thought that was more to do with like marching, or in the trailer, you could hear it. I thought maybe it might be some sort of countdown, but we found out later on it's something completely different. It's people in the bleachers stomping their feet in celebration. And the sound is synonymous to celebration, but then it also becomes later on synonymous with how Opie feels about the aftermath. Is that sort of anxiety and tension
Right.
building up in him about what has happened and what has been done? Was this an idea that was established in the script and written down, or was it something that was built with time? And then just to add to that, do you know what? I'll let you answer that, and then I'll get to the second half of the question as well.
The stomping that we actually used in the film is from that scene, is from those people in that scene. So yeah, it was always just in the script. It was always an idea, and it's a great use of just referencing what was going on in Oppie's mind at the time, and just him, like, I guess, pinpointing something of his anxiety of realizing what has been done and what he created. So yeah, it was one of those things that in the beginning, when I first watched the film, in the first, I was like, "What the heck is that?" And then when you get to that scene, you're like, "Oh man, now," and it just brings it all full circle. Now I know what's happening, and now I know what's going on. But yeah, the stomping was from production, and it gets played throughout the film. It's like its own character, essentially. It was crazy to work with because it's one of those things where you have to rhythmically. I had to make it seem like it was getting faster and louder and faster and louder. And sometimes when you're working on stuff like this, it gets edited throughout the process. And so I have to, like, these scenes get chopped up. And so I'd have to go back and redo the rhythm of the stomps to make it seem like it's building again. And it was a whole thing. It was a whole thing all the way up until the end, actually. But yeah, it's a great. Now that I saw the film recently again after not seeing it for a while, it's awesome. It's like its own character. It's like I was saying.
I saw this on Twitter, so I can't take credit for this, but people were really complimentary of that scene, and they were blown away just by how effective they were. Some people were like, I didn't realize I was crying during that scene. There's somebody who flagged saying, I think I heard screams when Opie's looking at crowd members. is it true that you kind of put in a Scream soundtrack in there as well, just
Yeah,
to
there's
emphasize aftermath of what's happened? And what
yeah.
else would you have peppered in for audiences to sort of keep an ear out for?
Yeah, it's supposed to be a jarring, stressful. It's I mean anything short of just calling it like horror, but there's all kinds of stuff in there, and it's all designed to make you feel uncomfortable. There's definitely screams. There's all kinds of stuff in there, and it's at that moment that Oppie realized what he did, and I think it's we're all kind of playing what he is thinking in his mind, and they're all not good things. It's all bad things that are happening. So
I think the best way I could describe it to someone is it's like in Terminator 2 when Sarah Connor's got her screaming at the playground of herself with John, and then the bomb explodes, and then they have the nuclear fallout, and it's like, wow, like it's a really sort of horrifying image. But then with this, it's more of a horrifying sound because this is something that somebody's going to carry with them the rest of their life, and you see it and hear it in various scenes. So I think one of them is during I think it might be when he's with President Truman, might be one of them. And another one will be during the kangaroo trial, should we say, the kangaroo court trial, shall we say. But please correct me if I've got it completely wrong.
he
Um,
did. Are you talking about the stomps?
the stomping, yeah, because then
Yeah.
you can see it, the camera stuff becomes like sort of unfocused as well.
Right.
It feels like he's being overtaken by it all.
Yeah, it's just all of the emotion and everything that he's dealing with in his mind. There's yeah, the President Truman scene, it doesn't happen, but it happens when he's meeting with the commission, with the Atomic Commission, and he's thinking back. Like there's definitely some big time jumps, so you're supposed to reference like if it's in black and white, it's in the past. You know, if it's in color, it's sort of in the future. Blah blah blah. But yeah, it happens in the scene where he's meeting with the Atomic Commission. It happens in the scene where they're doing the security hearing, the kangaroo court, as you called it. But yeah, it just keeps referencing back to when he's thinking back of when it happened, and that specific memory of him at Los Alamos, him talking to pretty much all of the Los Alamos people, and now in his mind, he's when he thinks back to that, he's referencing those stomps, and it's great. Like it's such a good point and its own character of the story.
Yeah, and I think it's just done so well, peppering that in during the film. As audience members, you don't know what it is, so you can't really relate to if it is something celebration, dread, or whatever. And once you do, then you know what becomes. When you hear that sound, you know that it's not good, basically.
Right. It's not a good thing.
Just to jump back to another scene, because like at the beginning of the film, we see OP struggling a lot in his studies in Cambridge. And there's times where he'll be sitting there and it'll cut between him in his sort of angst, should we say, and then atoms moving around and colliding. Like as an audience member, it was very sort of like very immersive and you could feel that bass and the sound of it, the atoms hitting one another. Was that a sound that you guys created, or was that something created by the composer?
All those like the vignettes of when we're kind of in his mind, he's kind of visualizing physics and science, and all that stuff was what we did, and it was probably the most fun part to work on in the film because it was sound that those sounds don't exist when you're thinking of science in your mind. There's no sound to it, so we had to just kind of watch it, and I had to just figure out what made sense and what kind of synced to what was happening on the screen.
I think as well because there's like science behind it. I know this just sort of popped into my head as well. This would be a two-hander. I guess with like atoms colliding and sounds and then breaking up, and then also with the film being centered on an atomic bomb and hydrogen and splitting atoms. When you're creating the sounds for this more scientific aspects of the film, do you consult with outside sources like scientists on how it sounds, or is it a case of just okay going into a room and creating the sound design from scratch and then just sort of making it sound like that it could be two atoms colliding or coming apart?
Yeah. There's is a bit of research that goes on, and I'll go online and look up things, but for the most part it just boils down to it making sense in the scene and playing well against the score and looking like it's like I keep saying, look like if you believe if you look at it and you believe that's how whatever's happening on screen sounds like that, then the goal has been made. Because there's no way, nobody really knows if that, I mean, that stuff just at the micro scale of science, like that doesn't have, there's no sound to it. So you just have to do a bunch of different things and try to a bunch of different things, and whatever makes sense or whatever kind of sticks to the screen is what works. And all those things that it goes through so many different versions. So we just will try something, it'll get up in the screen, and we'll work on it for months, and then we'll come back and we'll watch it again and be like, oh yeah, maybe we could change a little bit of this or completely change it, or it just kind of depends on how the whole film evolves to the end. Because the score at the time, sometimes it's a temp score, so we'll do something up against that and it'll work, and then the real score will come in and sometimes that won't work. So it's like constantly evolving, but mostly it boils down to if we believe it and if it sticks to the screen and if it works with the score.
With the idea that like no one's actually heard this sort of sound as well, which is crazy to think a little bit, because we can potentially see atoms and actually understand how they move and collide, but we can never actually understand the sound of it or create anything to the sound of it, as
Right.
I know yet. So it could change at a certain point, but having that creative freedom of being like, well, we don't know what it sounds like, we can do whatever we want to make it sound like two atoms breaking apart and colliding, and even or like the fission side of it all, because we have so much sort of, I guess, a sort of a clean slate and a canvas that we can create whatever we want on and then build it from there.
It's a lot of, and for lack of a better term, it's a lot of experimenting and just looking at the way something moves and thinking like, oh, I wonder what sound is going to match that, what the way that thing is moving, or there's a couple of those vignettes where you see, and I honestly don't specifically know what it is, but you see a lot of like fluttering and just movement, and so you just go through and you start creating sounds that you think will match that sort of movement. Is kind of what it boils down to. If it's matching and syncing up to that movement, then that's what we're trying to do.
I think as well, like that flickering, something seen in the film, or even when it does cut to those atom sound, I think you as an audience member need to know that these ideas, and because they're at their time theoretical, until they become practical, I think you kind of need to really pull the audience member to be like, these are really big moments of scientific discovery that you're watching on screen, and that like there's a reason why it's been put in there, and there's a reason why it's so bombastic.
Right.
And there's definitely one of those scenes where it was like it gave my back a massage of how loud it was in the scene, but it still was fantastic. The scene, not the massage, sorry. But we've mentioned about formats and how the film's being projected in IMAX 70mm and probably in sort of normal projectors as well. When you're creating the sound design for different formats, does your designing change in a way? Do you have to take those sort of formats into consideration, or is it just the same across the board?
It should be the same across the board. And there's Chris's films in particular, he only does 5:1 mixes, and most, if not all, theaters are able to do 5:1. So when we're doing these scenes, when we're creating it, we do it with 5:1 in mind. And then when it gets, they'll make a mix for streaming or for TV, and that stuff gets like folded down. So when we're creating a scene, we don't take that into context. We just kind of do it 5:1, and then when they are creating those other mixes, it just gets folded down, and then it just gets just created in such a way that it should be the same across all the formats, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Just so that people understand, how would you sort of describe 5:1 to like an average Joe on the street?
Yeah, it's 5 different channels. You have your center channel, and then you have your left and your right, and then there's rear, left, and right, and then there's a sub channel. So it's 5 speakers, point one, and the point one is the sub speaker. So usually, if not always, scenes, the dialogue is in the center. And then if there's something that kind of moves across the screen, it'll go through, a right channel, center channel, left channel. And then backgrounds and things like that are in the rear channels. And then when it's like you're saying, when something is vibrating or punching you in the gut, that's usually comes from the sub channel.
All right, cool. I know I know that like most systems have that 5.1, but also just it's always curious to know how some of that stuff works because I know my mum when she was watching a scene, she's like, "Oh, how do they do it when people are whispering and it's to your left, it's to your right? How does this
Right.
work?" So sometimes it's really fascinating as talking to experts like yourselves to actually understand the explanation for someone who won't know. But I still think like when it goes to streaming or home video, well not video now, but to sort of VOD and DVD and whatnot. Do you ever worry about the sound folding over? So when people watch it at home, that it's slightly different, or is that just a case of we plan for it when we do the final mix?
Yeah. Yeah, when they're doing the final mix, they'll gear it in such a way that it will be something like a home theater or out of a TV speaker, or so they do definitely take things in consideration. There's some of the sounds, some stuff just doesn't play right out of a TV speaker or a home theater. So they'll take that in consideration when they're mixing. But it's like I was saying before, when we're creating something, we don't think, oh, this isn't going to work on television, so we shouldn't cut it like, or we shouldn't make it like this. We just do it how it would be listened to or viewed into a theater, and then they just kind of while they're mixing, they EQ it and do certain things to make it hopefully be as close as possible to a theater experience. It's not going to be the same, but it's as close as it can be.
Do you ever worry about people just watching certain films that you've worked on, or this film, for example, when it comes out on VOD, to watch it on their phones with their AirPods, for example? Is that something that makes you like, it's like nails on a chalkboard for you?
Right. It makes me want to be like, come on, like it would be such a better experience if you saw it in the theater, but you can't stop people, and you want people to see the film, and if that's the only way they can see it, it's fine. But yeah, I mean, it would be great if everyone could see it in a theater, but that's not realistic. My wife, she watches movies on her phone all the time, and I give her crap for it, but it's just some people like doing that, and it's fine. It's you can watch a movie however you want, but I think it's a better experience if you see it in the theater.
Okay. Well, I agree. Like, look, I'm guilty of watching a film on the phone just because sometimes you're traveling on the
Yeah.
train and it's the easiest method, but make sure you watch this film in the cinema with like the
Yeah,
best sound
especially
system.
something like this. Like it's beautifully shot, and the 70 millimeter like IMAX format is so huge, and you're definitely not experiencing something the way it was intended. You can still see that some shots are beautiful on your phone, but it's just a way better experience seeing in the theater.
Yeah, 100%. And just to sort of get to my penultimate question, was there ever a time during the sound design process where a scene was partially shot and then once it was edited together, the scene kind of felt slightly different? Was there any times where you would have to change your sound design to go with what's been shot?
Yeah, and that happens all the time. With other films, when they're hashing out the visual effects, you don't get to see what it really is going to look like until the end. And so it always evolves up until the very end when you're finishing up the film. With this movie in particular, because Chris is so adamant about trying to use practical effects and real in-camera things, that we actually, a lot of those vignettes, for example, of when Oppie's thinking in his mind of physics and stuff, all that was already, it was in existence very early on. So luckily we had that whole breadth of time to figure out how those scenes were going to sound. But sometimes in other films, yes, you do have to change what you did earlier to match kind of how it evolves into something later. But for this film in particular, most of the stuff was the way it was since the beginning, which is great. It's not always the case, but
Just out of curiosity as well, before I get to my final question, when you're working on the final mix and creating sounds for each scene, I'm not sure how hard this question might be to answer, but do you know on average how many sort of, not takes, but times you would have to sort of create the sound design and then go back and change it? Or is it a case it just varies from scene to scene?
it varies from scene to scene. And like I was saying before, when we're working on a film, we work on it in reels. And this film in particular, I think, had like 8 reels. So some reels don't get touched and are great how they are, and then some reels they change a lot like throughout the process. So it's very common that you will work on something for months and then it just gets completely flipped around and scenes get shifted around, and it's just the way the game goes. So it's usually a constant. There's always constant evolution of what you're doing and what we're doing to match what's happening on screen. And so that's the crazy thing about filmmaking, is it goes through months and months and months of just of you make a version of it, you screen it, you change it, screen it again, you change it again, and it's just all the way up until the end, until it's, it's final cut, as they would say.
With like sound design, and I know we're going slightly off topic with Oppenheimer, but I'm just this is just sort of like scratch I want to sort of itch in terms of question wise, and maybe this does relate to Oppenheimer. But when you're working on reels, are these? I'm just picturing sort of like big film reels of like the IMAX, and then playing it back on the big screen, and then you're in the studio and then adding things slowly in, or is that or are the reels digitized?
When we're working on it, the reels are digitized. There is a film version of it that exists, and so when they'll cut certain scenes, or they'll make a new version of something, they cut the film, like analog film, and then it gets digitized, and then we get it, because we can't, obviously, because we work on Pro Tools, we work on computers, so there's no way for us to be able to work with a synced, film in a projector and stuff. So it's not realistic. But yeah, when we're working on it, it's obviously digitized and everything is time coded, and so everything's synced. And when they do their changes, we get notes of what changes they made, and then we change it on our end.
Oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense as well. Like, imagine syncing up to the reels of like something being played. That would I don't know. I think you guys will still be there now today.
Yeah, it would be very complicated. But there is a group of editors. When you see the film again and you watch the credits, there is a handful, probably 5 or 6 editors that are the film editors, and they're there actually cutting and splicing and pasting the film print. And then there's the digital assistant editors who are doing the same thing, but they're doing it in the digital realm.
Wow, so like proper old school, going back on the Steam banks and going through, wow, like I've done that once, and like the pressure of like, is this the right place you're cutting? And then
Totally.
taping it and being like that is like, wow. And then also using like having to be so delicate, or like hats off to those people that they managed to do that.
And it's a lost art, right? So a lot of those people, there isn't a lot of them that exist now. And especially with IMAX film, there's only a certain amount of people that know how to do it. So, and those are the people that Chris needs to use for these films.
And keep sweet as well when the next one rolls on.
Totally.
Just to get to my final question, what was your favorite scene to do the sound design on?
Probably all the like we were talking about earlier, all the vignettes of everything that was in Oppie's mind. I think it was probably my favorite. It was just one of those things and like I keep saying, you don't really know in reality how this stuff sounds, so you have to try like the most random things and throw things up against a wall, see what sticks, see what makes sense, and it's hard trying to find things that are exactly synced to whatever movement is on the screen. So it's months, probably like a good 6 to 8 months of just trying everything you can and just making it as cool and as interesting and impactful as you can get it to be.
Yeah, and I know I alluded to it earlier about how important sound is, but then it's also just as like an enjoyment for audience members, and also probably quite enjoyment for you guys to build sound and create sound for these sort of films, where it can be you can go from a very quiet moment to a very loud, bombastic moment, and really, I feel like as well, like make the audience jump and be scared and feel being actually there at the time.
Yeah, it should have some, emotional response, and there should be moments where you are jumping out of your seat and you are overwhelmed and you're stressed and you are sad, and what we're doing, it should support what's happening on the screen.
Yeah, and you don't want it to be. I think you need to work everything in tandem, so no one sort of not overshines, but takes the limelight from each person.
Totally. Yeah. We should be supporting the story, and whatever we're doing in that sense, it should be supporting it, and it should be enhancing it or even dumbing it down at times, or making it awkwardly quiet before something crazy happens. Just all of that is into consideration.
There is one more question that
Yeah.
has popped into my mind, so apologies. I know I said I had the last one, but there's one scene where Opie goes to Chicago, I believe, and they start walking around. They walk into an area of like where you could hear like the radioactivity like ticking away on like the Geiger counter. That sound as well is very much like a sound full of dread, and I think Chernobyl kind of showed that to us with that sound. And as audience members, when you hear that sound, you kind of like, I think you should be running away as fast as you can. But when it came to that sort of scene as well, because I think that is another scene where, like, as an audience member, it is like this. You start feeling the scale of like what's being done. Do you feel like with creating the sound design for that, do you kind of want to add the sort of more of a horror element to it, so that you're serving that story of like people aren't realizing what's going to be unleashed when they do something like this?
Right, right. That scene in particular, I think I think you're referencing when he goes to Chicago, it's underneath the football stadium. And that was the very first, they were talking about, that was the very first self-sustaining nuclear reaction. And then that in particular, I think we were just using just a Geiger counter sound. And from what I remember, it was just as simple as possible. I don't think there was a lot of thought into just making it scarier. I think that sound just in general is just kind of scary because you relate that to radiation and you relate to how dangerous radiation is. So I think it just kind of adds how it played by itself. There definitely wasn't like a thought of, oh, we should make this kind of a horror like thing.
The sound just does it itself with that like
Does it?
weird ticking.
Some of that too. A lot of the some of the score, there is kind of a replaying character in the score of that sort of Geiger counter ticking stuff that gets played, which I don't know in particular if in the score it's in that scene, but when we were working in that scene in particular, there wasn't any thought of trying to do something scarier. I just think it's just in general that sound is just scary. So
yeah, 100%. And with that sound having the connotations of being with radiation and just being like, get out of there, it just adds to it. But as well, like that, it's like that the idea of like we've done something really big, but then it's also like, oh man, this is a shaky ground, and it's just like this is a quite an amazing scientific discovery, but also just like, oh wow, the sound just it gives me the creeps just thinking about it.
Totally.
Randy, thank you so much for your time today. Oppenheimer is in cinemas. See it on the biggest screen possible, best sound possible, to appreciate Randy's work and his team as well, and Richard King as well. Thank you again.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. You take care, and bye-bye.
See ya.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.